An anthology covering the Stone, Iron, and Bronze Ages, we are presented with a series of tales of a simpler world, long before computers, cars, and modern civilization. While not something that would normally catch my attention, I was intrigued by the premise, and so I gave it a read. A series of stories in the various settings of the author's choosing, we follow several tales of different characters as they experience a world much different than the one we know. The first story in the lineup, it does a good job setting the tone for the collection. I was already familiar with the author's character and basic mythology, though it was nice to get a chance to explore these characters more directly. Telling the story of Sakara and Kayodé, two fox brothers who are caught up in a thunderstorm, we see how they relate to each other and the larger world. I feel like Sakara did a good job of conveying the brotherly relationship, and I really enjoyed the back and forth between them. I thought the mythology provided a unique perspective to the simple nature of a thunderstorm, and it suited the story well. The narrative flowed well from one scene to the next, and I think it wrapped up very nicely. All in all, a strong start to the collection. I'll start by saying this one had elements that I really liked, but at least in part it confused me. I've enjoyed the author's novel work, but when I read this, it was a bit hard to track what was real and what was not, and I think perhaps it might have been better suited for a larger story. While I know it won some awards, I think for me personally, I was unprepared for the mystical elements of it, really just expecting a historical fiction anthology to not have any such aspects. I enjoyed the first half. I think Utunu did a really good job conveying what it feels like being the outsider. Shrek definitely felt relatable, and I liked the exploration of his being someone who hadn't yet become one of the group. I expected the story to continue in that vein, resulting in him eventually earning his place, though it ended up going in a different direction. I applaud the author's efforts and blame my lack of enthusiasm for this story on my own expectations rather than any issue with the author's skill. Another really interesting tale, this story is told from the perspective of an outsider who doesn't exactly understand the people he interacts with, but they communicate well enough. It really conveys the uniqueness and challenge of conveying ideas without a common language or level of sophistication. The main character is a trader that visits the village to get the things he cannot produce himself. I thought the author made good use of the furry aspects of the story, with the woolly rhino demonstrating his talents to help the hyenas who lack his strength and skills. In turn, the hyenas possess the ability to produce tools and other assorted useful things. I thought the ending was really good, and it was a perfectly encapsulated tale. As an adopted individual myself, I really enjoyed this story. It follows a wolf adopted by a group of hares, to which he is more or less treated as one of the family. Things get complicated when it turns out that there are other wolves in the area. I think that it does a good job introducing a character who is both one of the group and yet not, as well as the unique experience of being confronted with your culture of origin to which you have little familiarity. It really conveys the metaphor of adoption well, and as someone who strongly believes that the way people are raised has an effect on their belief systems, it was an interesting exercise in wondering what it would have been like had Found Moon been raised by his own kind. While I won't spoil anything, I will say that the story had a lot of layers and kept my interest well. I've been thinking all week about what to say about this story. It's about a pair of cheetahs, one of whom begins their journey with the ability to see the future and his efforts to determine what to do about it. It's fairly narrow in scope with just two characters having a shared experience, but I think this one just kind of didn't really resonate with me. I've read the author's work before and liked it, and it was a well-written exchange, but searching for something I could point to, I'm hard-pressed to do that. I had to look up what Eyeshine was, since I've seen it countless times but never knew the word for it, so it taught me something new. I guess my issue is that stories based around visions are hard sells for me because by definition not much actually happens. Now I will say that the author does a very good job of presenting a momentary glimpse of a world the main character can have no conception of. For example, how would you describe the world to someone so far in the past? But I question if a view of modernity, however fleeting, takes away from being a Stone Age setting. I suppose this is one of those ideas that I think might have played better for me if it was part of a larger story, and we had time to see the consequences of him seeing the vision and what happened from there. A good entry, but one that I had a hard time connecting with personally. The last story in the Stone Age section, I thought this one was really enjoyable. It managed to tell a complete story, follow the young starling as she and her tribe face tragedy when the disaster their seer foretold comes to pass. I thought this one set up the story well, with some really vivid descriptions of what was going on, along with some really enjoyable characters. I thought it worked well and had a satisfying ending. If I had to make a critique, it would probably be that in a couple of places the author used the same word over and over in quick succession. But other than that very minor flaw, a great way to close out the Stone Age. This was a very unconventional story compared to what I'm used to reading, but I really thought it came off well. It was an interesting reading a tale with a main character that experienced the world without sight and all of the things we tend to take for granted as seeing individuals. It was well constructed, the story flowed well, and I thought that the repetition served to reinforce the points of the story. I like the main character, and as an introduction to the Bronze Age, I think it served as a good lead-in to the next period of history. The only criticism I might lay against this one is the fact that the main character is healed by the gods and given his sight. While this doesn't bother me, I often see it highlighted as a strong thing not to do with disability representation, as it implies that the disabled are lesser than or need to be fixed, so it might not be well received among the disabled community. I can't remember if I've read anything by this author before, but I definitely enjoyed it. A little more skinning than I expected, but it tells the tale of Akachi, a warrior and adherent to the Lilies who, along with his brother, lives with the tribe of jackals. Under constant siege by the lions who expand ever outward, they seek a way to protect their village and its people from the constant advance of the enemy forces. I thought that despite the subject matter, there was a lot of humor present. I thought Akachi and his brother worked well together as characters, and despite being a short story, they managed to infuse a lot of character in the space they had. It had a lot of good detail in it, and I thought it was definitely an enjoyable piece. I'd like to start by saying that I'm not a huge fan of overly long titles, as they're hard to remember and a little awkward. That being said, the story itself. I didn't initially think I was going to like this one, but as I started reading, I started getting interested. The story tells the tale of an unconventional romance between an oracle and someone who arrives one day seeking their counsel. Now, over the course of the story, the oracle is faced with a choice to literally define their lover's destiny, at least as far as they know. The story tells the tale in stages, building up each character and who they are before ostensibly making a decision, and at the end, it muses on 3 possibilities, giving a rather unexpected ending line that caught me by surprise. A solid entry. The story had a fair amount of positives. I liked the characters. Amalu and Naum had a good chemistry together. The story flowed well, but the ending felt a bit unsatisfying. Maybe it was the slight time jump or the way that the main characters really only have agency if you're of a more spiritual bent. I think that the scene change really could have just continued from where it left off, but other than making the pilgrimage to the shrine, it isn't really clear what they did, if anything, when they got there. I will admit I do believe in the power of prayer, though my relationship with organized religion is less stable, but perhaps it's because I prefer a more practical resolution, such as moving the boulder to restore the river, versus relying solely on prayer to solve the issue. Nevertheless, it was wrapped up well and a decent entry to the collection. What little critiques I have aren't anything I'd consider more than personal taste, and it was a solid story. Tech is a leopardess and funerary priest on a pilgrimage to complete a 7-day trial. I must admit, this one wasn't one of the stories that really stuck with me. I remember during the read it seemed like it was going somewhere, but the ending fell a little flat for me. The characterization was good, although other than a mention or two about the main character species, I forgot a few times what she was. This was better handled with the characters she interacted with, as I was refreshed every now and then on the species the author chose. While the foreshadowing was well inserted, I think that they didn't really stick the landing, as I expected following the end of the story for the characters to either move on, come to terms with what she learned, or something else. It kind of felt like one of the stories that just ended without any real resolution, at least not one apparent to me. I was left not knowing how to feel afterwards, and I think that had there been a little more of a coda, this might have been a more solid story. As it is, an unremarkable entry. This was an interesting story, hard at least for me to compress into a few words, but I'll do what I can. The premise involves a prince and a small army being sent to retrieve a tusk from a giant presumed to be a woolly mammoth, although it is never explicitly stated, which will bring prosperity to his kingdom. During the attempt, he is separated from his party and meets someone who prompts Anachu to consider his actions carefully. Ultimately, he is able to satisfy the spirit of the quest, if not in the way he'd originally expected. I liked the fact that the story had depth to it and encouraged both the protagonist and the reader to think critically about what was going on, and it managed to accomplish what I feel was a complete story in the space that it had. Although I am not crazy about the removal of the giant's tusks, even though such an act is not fatal, it was a good entry and I enjoyed it. This was the first of Pascal's stories I've ever read, and it circles around the funeral and inner thoughts of a character who is sorting out their emotions following the death of someone that, to them, at best engenders mixed feelings. I happen to know that this story bears some personal significance for the author, having been aware of his personal history through our shared writing group, so I had the added context of knowing where the emotions were coming from. Perhaps written as a bit of a cathartic experience, it did sort of raise the question as to what happens in a situation where everyone expects you to praise and memorialize the dead, but as someone who knew them differently than everyone else, what does that mean for you as an individual? Now, I don't know if it functions as much as a thought piece for the average reader, but I found it to get me thinking, which is always a good thing. All in all, I'd read more of his work. I can't say how much I thought it was representative of the Iron Age, but that could be the fault of my ignorance rather than an actual critique. The final story in the anthology, it follows a character named Sakarafox as he finds himself caught between a past he can't escape and an uncertain future. Traveling to a village, he is haunted by the choices he was forced to make, but nevertheless seeks to find peace. If only his past will let him. I thought the story was interesting, reminding me that sometimes life is complicated, and while some wounds can be repaired, there are some times when it's just not possible. It was told well and served as a pretty good wrap-up to the collection.
If you like werewolves, check out my book Blue Moon, available in paperback and ebook on Amazon. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. Catch you later.